Welcome to episode 2 of Defense Disrupted. My name is Ian, and I'm honored here to be joined by two gentlemen, both named Ed, because we figured the first podcast was so good we'd confuse our listeners by having two guests with the same first name in our second episode. I'm joined and honored to be here with Ed Padinske and Ed Sullivan. For the future of this conversation, I'm going to refer to them as Pad-Eye, which for the naval folks on the line may recognize as it may or may not be a nautical reference. That'll be our sailor on the line. And I'll go by Sully for Mr. Ed Sullivan, a Marine who will have a chance to talk a little bit about his career. So Pad-Eye and Sully, welcome to Defense Disrupted.
Thanks. Great to be here.
Looking at each other already. That's good. This is good. I actually want a little bit of the Navy and Marine Corps competition and the fact that you're stomping on each other already. Excellent tone to kick off this conversation. So I have a few questions for you both. I'm going to start with a couple of rapid fire questions as an opportunity for you each to give a bit of an introduction. And then we'll get into some hopefully a fun conversation about the future of national security and what our nation is seeing, perhaps even the opportunities out there in the world. So first question, I'm going to go Pad-Eye first. What was your first job in the U.S. military?
Well, after I got out of school, I was an intelligence officer, went through intel school, ended up taking my first set of orders to Fighter Squadron 2, the Bounty Hunters, call sign Bullet, out in Naval Air Station, Miramar, California, before we surrendered that base to the Marines.
And with that transition, Sully, what was your first job in the Marine Corps?
My first job in the Marine Corps, I was a logistics officer. And so I went out to Marine Aviation Logistics Squadron 36, or MALS 36 in Fatima, Japan, out in Okinawa. And the very first thing I realized is that, one, they didn't know what to do with the second lieutenant because they just didn't see him. And two, there wasn't a single piece of equipment at the unit that we had covered in my school because it was all aviation specific stuff. And so this is a little different. So that's how I started.
That's funny. The what we learned in school and what we saw out in the battlefield may be a theme we should come back to in a few minutes. But thank you for that quick answer. And then what was one of your last jobs in uniform? Sully, let's go to you. How did you complete your time in the U.S. Marine Corps?
Well, you've managed to bookend my career without touching intelligence, which was most of it. But the last job that I had was I was the chief of staff, the deputy commander for the Marine Corps Recruit Depot San Diego in the Western recruiting region. So it meant that we were responsible for recruiting all new Marines from about Japan in the west to Indiana in the east, and then bring them to San Diego, conducting boot camp and maintaining all the facilities.
We're going to come back to that intelligence opportunity because I think that's one of the fun similarities with your other Ed here on the line. But Pat, what was one of your last tours of duty?
So last 2 tours in a row, same duty station. I was the senior intelligence officer for all of the Navy's special warfare units, so the SEAL teams, the boat teams, SEAL delivery vehicle teams, those kind of things. And then had an offer I couldn't refuse to stay on an extra year as the Commander's Action Group Director for Naval Special Warfare, which is sort of this general manager, chief operating officer, wrote a ton of policy and directives and those kind of things. And that's where I closed out my uniform time.
Okay. And so let's go to some of the middles, but I'm going to ask it in a funny way. Both of you are military intelligence professionals and veterans, but I'm going to ask an unfair question to see if we can better expand into what you did during those years of service. So I'll start with Pad-Eye. If you could have an intel job in the Marine Corps, what would it be?
That's a great question, Ian. I really enjoyed working with MARSOC and the Marine Raiders. I thought some of the things they did were phenomenal. They go light, they go fast, they go hard. I think it'd be cool to work in an intel there. On the regular side of the Marine Corps, I always worked with a number of aviation units. I found their aviation challenges to be pretty cool and similar and familiar with a lot of the Navy ones.
Brilliant. And now, Sully, I'll give you a little more of an open aperture to talk a little bit about your actual job in intel in the Marine Corps. But it's the same question. I'm going to see if you have any admiration for your naval colleagues. If you had a opportunity to serve in a Navy, not Marine Corps, a Navy uniform, what would it have been?
I probably, oddly enough, would have gone in the submarines.
Oh.
Now the part of you, there's a little Marine in every submarine, right? But I just thought they were interesting. I thought
Sorry, I just want to make, for those not watching on camera, I just wanted to be able to say that Pad-Eye just gave this disgusting, like such a bad dad joke look on his faces.
Yeah.
You'll be lost to the realms of the audio only. But sorry, Sully, I interrupted you, please, sir.
Yeah, well, I once actually got a lot of mileage out of that by introducing myself to the Indian Naval Attaché or Defense Attaché when we were in Muscat, Oman, who was a submariner. And so I let off with that, and I had a best friend for life from that one. So. That was good. I think it was the submarines. It was just the complexity and the fact that it is really a sensing mission in its entirety of where you're at, what's going on, and what's happening. And so that just always intrigued me. Though for the record, I hate being in water where I can't see the bottom. So, but what the hell? I'm in a big black tube anyway, so it doesn't matter.
And we can expand a bit more on your time, Sully, in the Marine Corps. If you can share some anecdotes of some of the operational requirements or things that you can share about your intel work, that aspiration and curiosity for the larger intel mission, though, I think I want to give a little bit of an opportunity for you to share what you actually did in the Marine Corps for most of those years.
Well, I became an intel officer somewhat accidentally, in that I did my company grade time was largely as a logistics officer, and then I got selected to go be a Middle East foreign area officer. I got selected in 99, so started it in 2000, which means I was a little over a year into the 3.5-year program when 9/11 happened, and that changed the entire trajectory of my career. So all of 2003, I'd got my master's degree in Middle East studies. I had spent a 1.5 years studying Arabic, and then the government sent me for 1 year to just travel the Middle East to learn. You've learned the formal language, you've learned what the books say that people are like. Now go walk amongst them and see what they're really like. So I did that, and my thought was I had missed out on Afghanistan. I had missed out on Iraq. My career was over. I had an interesting run, but I was going to be the one guy without combat experience, and so as a Marine, it was going to be just not a functional career. And then I spent the next 4 years essentially in Iraq. Started as a cultural advisor, became the liaison to the city of Fallujah in 2004, and through that, started getting much more into human intelligence, into all source analysis, because a lot of what I was doing was just sitting down for hours on end, which a commander couldn't do, and a lot of the other, the grunts couldn't do. But just to sit down and talk to these leaders for hours on end, and then be able to go back and look at the analysis that was being done in the fusion center and say, hey, that's not accurate. And from talking to all these different people, this is what's really going on. And so there was really an arc of that went through from 2004 to 2008, where I had about 2.5 years in Iraq. And then I was a naval attaché for 3 years after that, which was interesting. I had some staff jobs. I commanded an intelligence battalion, which was a phenomenal experience out of Camp Lejeune. And then where I met Padinske the first time, just couldn't dodge him. I was at SOCOM headquarters, where I was in the J8 as an assessment director. So I was overseeing all the intelligence and information systems that SOF owns, which was a good opportunity really to pick at the scab that is information systems and the way that we do a lot of the acquisitions. I went from there to go fight ISIS one more time out in Syria and Iraq with the CJTF OIR as a deputy intel officer. And then it was 3rd Marine Air Wing in Miramar. And that kind of closed out the intel tour, was the senior intelligence officer for 3rd MAW. And then one tour just for fun out at the depot, like I said. So
Yeah,
it's kind of the arc of it, mainly Middle East focused, very much Arabia, Middle East, not Persian Middle East. But that was my gig.
thank you for sharing that, Sully. I want to spend some time taking a step back and hopefully having the Eds engage each other on some of those experiences and takeaways from the intelligence operations, to the extent that you can share some reflections. But I want to just round off the early intros here with as a brief point. I'm honored to be working with these two fine Americans, and I learn so much from them every single day, especially when we're out in the field. But their bios are just so deep and so rich with anecdotes and stories of supporting American national security that it's hard to choose a favorite anecdote. But one shameless plug I will give back over briefly to Padai is that, Sully mentioned 9/11 very briefly. One of the more interesting aspects, I think, of Padai's career is that he was one of the action officers in the White House Situation Room on 9/11. I won't go too deep into it other than to give a shameless plug that there's a pretty good book about his experience and others from that interesting room that we call the President's Situation Room. Is it Mr. Stephanopoulos who wrote that book, Pat? I can't recall exactly.
George Stephanopoulos. Yep.
All right. We should probably, we're all in the private sector now. We should probably put a embedded link where I get a penny for every click through on the YouTube video here. But those that are interested, it's a hell of a story. It's really fascinating. And Pat, I had a bunch of experiences at the front line as a junior officer in that time and moment, meeting history. But I'd like to now turn it over to some of those middle years, if we would. Work that you gentlemen both did in uniform, many years in service. I would say a lot of the overlaps are in intel. You've both done many things in many places. Jumped out of platforms that otherwise seem seaworthy and airworthy. You've had a bunch of things that you could have done. but it seems like most of your career was in intel, military intelligence. I did not serve as an intelligence officer. I barely understood what y'all did back when I was in uniform. And so I'm sincerely and curious and interested as to what that world was like. And I think maybe a transition question to get y'all sharing some stories. And I'd love to have you, please feel encouraged to ask each other questions on this conversation about national defense. Why'd you first get into military intelligence? Of all the things that you gentlemen could have done in the U.S. military, you've seen many different places. It seems like you spent most of your time in the intel function. Why? What first brought you into that? Why'd you stay with it? So I don't know, whoever wants to take that first.
I'll take first swing at that one. I joined the Navy to pay for school. A great way to do it. A lot of us had done the same thing with the intent of serving for about 4 or 5 years and moving on to something else. And it just so happens while I was in school, I had an opportunity to work overseas a bit. I worked as a journalist in Moscow right after the fall of the Soviet Union, lived in Estonia doing some risk analysis and building a plan for the government to change their former Soviet air bases into free trade zones and light industrial complexes. And by happenstance, one of the same time periods, I got to deploy on a submarine, USS Baton Rouge, SSN 689, out in the Atlantic. Spent about 6 weeks underway. I realized submarines probably not for me. I'm fascinated with the complexity, like Sully said. But we were on an intel mission, and I got to spend time with an intel officer and a small intel team that was doing some pretty cool stuff. So I kind of kept my eye out for an opportunity maybe to join that part of the service. I got lucky, applied, got in, went right into school, and then ever since then, I think I found, especially in the first 4 or 5 years, really enjoyed working with small teams with hard problems. And much more so in a forward environment. I actually love being on aircraft carriers and those kind of things. So,
if I can interrupt you real quick, you're shorthanding something, but I'd love to dig into it. The intel was interesting, okay, and small teams, maybe that's a dimension of maybe a camaraderie or connection to a group of people doing. But what was so interesting about it? I mean, some folks like missiles because they're interesting. Like what about intel made it interesting to you?
It is so broad, Ian, and it is. I mean, I think a lot of intel officers, good ones, thrive on the pressure of having a commander who is demanding omniscience and knowing that you at the same time are not a god. So you have to find that useful level of omniscience that's going to sort of create their advantage over the adversary. As a couple mentors of mine here always remind us that, as an intel officer, you have 2 jobs. One, well, maybe 3 jobs, but 2 jobs, 2 primary ones. One, penetrate the adversary, steal stuff, knowledge, information, data, details on weapon systems that the adversary does not want you to have. And the second one is penetrating the audience, like knowing your operator, knowing your decision maker better than anybody else maybe on their staff, how they make decisions, how they like their information. It's always super, super challenging. I think it demands a lot of curiosity. But again, back to it being so broad, especially in a Navy intel career, you're almost a generalist by demand signal, and you're a generalist by career track. You're not allowed to spend too much time in one specific area as you're a developing officer. So you might spend time with submarines, you might spend time with strike aviation on aircraft carriers, and then with SEAL teams and signals intelligence, and you get to delve into a lot of really cool things. And for me, in my second tour after NF-14D squadron was flying satellites for the National Reconnaissance Office. Completely different job. I was the dumbest person in the room for, that happened many times in my career, but I just learned an absolute ton. And I just, maybe by nature a bit curious, just create an opportunity to always feel like you're energized. Pretty cool. Sully, yes. For those people who aren't watching, Sully does look angry right now.
But see, as we discussed before the show, that's just how Sully looks. Okay. So anyway,
I think he's angry because the Marines had 6 jobs and the Navy intel was only 3. Oh, it's classic.
No, I wasn't going to mock the Navy part. I was going to mock the soft part, but being flush with manpower and resources. But I'd say mine it really did happen by accident to get into intelligence. But once I got into it, I found that was a better fit for the way my mind worked. I used to joke that I hate riddles. Okay, I don't like riddles because to me they don't seem that much of a point and what the payout is. So I get frustrated and I walk away from them. I'm not a big puzzle guy, but And I don't like to sit around and just ideate about what could be or what might happen for the sake of that. But I've found that in my career, if you put me in a pressure situation with limited variables, all of my mind kind of comes alive. And I don't know if somebody channels through me or what, but I worked for a year as the senior analyst for the Marine Corps in Iraq in January of '07 to January of '08. So, we did not have AI. We didn't have machine learning. We had some really crappy systems. And at the end of the day, a lot of it came down to me reading every report that was being generated and trying to make something out of it. And that was a situation that I thrived in and I enjoyed. And being able to see things and see the bigger picture from the limited bits of information that you have, I thought was a pretty fascinating thing. In a broader sense, that's what drew me into the foreign area officer realm as well. I was always a lover of history and cultures and things like that and what makes them tick. And then that just became a natural outgrowth then into intelligence.
Interesting. So let's talk more about those crappy systems. And by that, I'm not going to ask you to throw too many bombs at bad resource investments from the past. And maybe the most productive way to ask it is looking back, particularly on some of the intelligence work and intelligence operations. And so Iraq and Afghanistan, a major conflict, also a lot of iteration and a change to the battlefield. I think you both, though, were in uniform for some of the more recent transitions in American national security, even in uniform, let alone in your ongoing work on the civilian side. I'd love to learn more about, as you look back on your careers at Intel, what were some of those disruptions of the past? Did those crappy systems ever get better? Were there fundamental changes in ownership and leadership and the partners? As you think back about the disruptions of that historical context in your service, what do you think were some of those areas of major change?
I agree with Sully. I lived through, like a lot of our sailors and other service members lived through, just crappy software, crappy systems delivery. There was one that I won't name, a major program for the Navy deployed to aircraft carriers. The Navy decided the system as it is, decided to give it to me 2 days before deployment without training, without field service representation, without an engineer, and then expect daily reporting on how the thing's working, how this new program's working. And after 2 weeks, I decided we're on deployment. I unplugged it, looking for shipping information to send this stuff back home. Still to this day, I get the stink eye, if you will, from some of the people who are involved. Like, their lives and fortunes and sacred honor were based on the success of that system. Just terrible delivery. Maybe a decent system, but the customer experience matters too, right? Some of the transformations I've seen probably, Sully and I lived through this, although I'd argue Sully wasn't my best friend all the time on the SOCOM staff. He's my favorite assessment director.
I'm not sure he's your best friend now, Pat. I hate to break this to you. I know sometimes you guys share an office, but I'm pretty sure he doesn't have you in the highest regard.
We decided to launch into, and this is in the special operations community, where you sometimes have the flexibility to take some risks and try to move things forward, at least at small scale. And, constantly, there's a truism across all U.S. intel and probably worldwide, is that we always collect more than we can make sense of. And so one of the options, I'd been a fan, maybe a hobbyist in computer vision for a while, and had seen some of my analysts forward trying to interpret images and full motion video from drones and those kind of things. And the intel collection was always increasing, and our ability to process it was at best static. And then the human beings becoming overwhelmed. And so I think of one of my analysts out there, her name's Jen, I won't mention her full name, out in Africa, trying to look at 5 screens simultaneously, knowing that she's going to be blamed if something goes wrong, not just with the aircraft, but on the ground, because she's the overwatch of actions that are occurring involving U.S. forces. And so I put together a quick PowerPoint presentation, said, hey, there may be another way here. And luckily, Sully had just shown up as an assessment director. His boss and the J2 at SOCOM said, you're onto something here. Can we connect you with some people in the Pentagon? I'd like you to go brief them, because there may be some resources available to get started on something. And so, yeah, I said the word automation in front of the Deputy Secretary of Defense or one of his staffers, and told me to never say that again because it threatens people's jobs. I figured out another way to phrase it, got started. Sully luckily had arrived at SOCOM at that point. I think we had like weekly or bi-weekly updates, what was going on. We had a 4-month sprint working with some really cool Silicon Valley vendors, put something together and had it deployed in the battlefield in 4 months' time, which is at the time was unprecedented. That said, it wasn't perfect. It was in beta. We had a ton more work to do. So the transformations I've seen is always around, at least on the Intel side, and from the Intel perspective, is how can we deal with all of this data better to find the things we need to find, the most important things, the most decisionable things, and ultimately reduce risk to our forces and our missions. So those are sort of the transformations I've seen, but it's been incremental.
I'd throw one out there. So I mean, look at it, kind of big pivot points and things that change. And I would say probably in the 05, 06 timeframe, the preponderance of and availability of the internet and comms pathways and their capacity to transmit data meant that everybody, to include a whole lot of people that didn't need to, could now play in the fight and be part of it. And so what I recall seeing at the time was, you do the tour of the federal agencies before you'd go out to Iraq. And you'd see these tours and everybody's building their new wash floor. We've got a new wash floor. We've got all the agencies represented and we're all here and we can do, assistance out to the forward edge and look at all the stuff we're going to bring to the fight. And I remember looking at it, I was always thinking like, you're not bringing anything, man. I mean, if you want to monitor what's going on and it's a big picture, fine. But most of the time it was this rush to justify people's existence because they could reach out and they could see what was going on at the forward edge. So now they wanted to be part of it. And once I got out into the role of the senior analyst, then it was really the biggest impact was people who weren't really involved in what was going on or didn't need to be would send you their products to see, hey, could you QC this? I wrote this paper about it, what's going on in Iraq, and I'd like to see if this applies to Al-Anbar. Could you proofread it? No, I'm not going to proofread it because you don't matter right now. Okay. We're kind of busy. We have stuff going on, but it was so many people could reach in and be in your business. I think it really changed a lot of the dynamics of how things were done and how things went on.
There's an interesting tension that I'm hearing in your two stories. On one side, I'm gonna paraphrase it. It seems that there's this reality to need to know what bad guys are doing, and so you collect data. There's this collection, but there's also, it seems to the Paddy's point, not enough manpower to analyze as much as we would want. At the same point, to contrast with Sullivan's point, with new tech, you could have more folks reaching in to try to help, but they're not helping. So I see these kind of two arrows colliding with each other, that more data is going up and good intentions are going the other way, but in the middle, it's not working. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, I think it's fair.
Or it wasn't working at that time. Yeah.
It's fair to say very broadly, there's a lot of people and there's a lot of tools, but there's a lot of people that you still have to understand Intel and you still have to understand the art of it and have some actual inclination and ability. And there's a whole lot of people that regardless of what tool you give them, they're not going to do a good job with it. Okay. So the technology can help and the technology can play a big role and save a ton of time and bring a lot of efficiencies in, but you still have to have the right people at the other end and not think you can just push an easy button. You've got to have someone with the intellectual capacity, rigor, and inquisitiveness to do something with because you're going to find out with all the different sensors that are out there, information sources no one's ever had access to before, and information about the enemy. So we can bring it all to you, but you still have to have something in here that can put the picture together.
Yeah, I don't think there's definitely a conflict there, but I would describe it this way: is the reason there's a conflict is because where that fulcrum sits on those pathways that you just described, is really about who's holding risk and where and why, right? That analyst that's reaching into Sully, hey, can you QC my paper? That guy or gal is worried about
no risk. Yeah.
That paper is going to some policymaker or to some higher headquarters that's not involved. Sully's worried about his commander and his Marines in the field that are holding very real risk, not like policy risk. Oh, that was misspelled, or I didn't like how you phrase that. But then there's like this third conflict, and Sully, I've been there too. It's like, in Afghanistan and Iraq as a J2s, is you didn't want that DIA analyst or the NCATC analyst or the ONI analyst writing something that misinterpreted what was going on because they didn't have a conversation with you. And so it's that risk of like silence is consent. And then something stupid. And then you end up answering 15 more RFIs because some agency's page, point paper conflicts with what you've been putting together in the field based on battlefield realities.
But at the end of the day, it's like little kids playing soccer and everybody wants to rush to the ball instead of just playing their damn position, which would make it a whole lot easier.
And that's why we always say remove balls from the field when you're playing swarm soccer.
I'm mixing my metaphors here because I'm trying to keep up with how it's, the ideal situation. And the intent of these questions is to put disruptions in context and to think about how has data been collected, how has intel been done. And I'm sincerely trying to learn more. I think everyone who would listen to this podcast would say that these are chaotic times that we're living in today. These feel very disruptive. A lot of changes just this week in the news in terms of reorganizations and new leadership within the DoD, the intelligence community, the way AI is impacting the tool set forward. And I think all good times of chaos and potentially crisis, I think people's natural reaction is to think, oh, this has never happened before. I've never seen it this bad before. And the skeptic that I am is that really the case? You gentlemen have more years of service. And so I implicitly assume that there's wisdom in those years. And I was trying to flesh out, is this really that different of a moment today in light of the warfare and work that you've done in the decades prior? While there have been aspects, it sounds like, of a transition and different fights with different enemies, what I'm trying to figure out is while analysts have been overwhelmed by information, upstream, downstream, personally, I'm curious, is there a categorical change in the amount of megabytes to eyeballs that is just fundamentally changing the fight? Or is this just the next chapter in what you've all been working on for decades?
As a Marine, I didn't have access to a lot of resources like Ed did, so I'll defer to him.
What's it like to be so rich, Pat? It sounds like you've had a lot of resources over there. Although I think I think the Marine Corps beats you on recruiting numbers. I have to go back and I don't know how much impact you've had on that.
There might be a legion of data about that.
Yeah. And at least one commander who did some of that in the Southern California region.
And I'd say I've always been rich in data, very wealthy in data. Sully's always been wealthy in whining. So we'll move forward from there. I would say probably one of the biggest challenges is just the sheer volume of information now that's available to the analysts. Think of like what used to be when Sully and I first came in the military, most of our sources of intel were sort of exquisite, national, technical, government programs, not accessible to others. And mainly because now the internet, the information ecosystem is now just totally globalized. I can access as much information, much more information just from my laptop than I ever could before. That data is now exposed to analysts, and there's valuable troves of information within open source data, so that it's almost exacerbated the problem a bit. And then throw in disinformation. Always working against that, especially, some very sophisticated adversaries that are flooding the space, flooding the zone, so to speak, with all sorts of confusing disinformation. It makes an analyst job much harder.
So anything to add there in terms of how different this moment is compared to times past?
I mean, I don't disagree. It goes back to kind of how I finished my last statement where I was talking about the kinds of information, the kind of sensors and stuff that were made available. Just didn't exist before. And we can make them more efficient. We can make the bytes of information and the bits of information more coherent. But at the end of the day, it still comes down to someone with some talent and art that looks at them and says, I think this is what's going to happen next, or this is what's going on right now. But as Ed was talking, really what my head had drifted to was how we're still in a time when personalities get involved in the procurement and the acquisition and can derail excellent things too, right? And what I mean by that is I remember having a very direct conversation with the general officer several years ago. I'll try to be as vague as I can, but it's probably a really thin veneer, where there was a system that it was just in vogue if you were a senior officer to hate this company and hate the system. And they would talk ill about it. But everybody who was using it loved it. And so it was one of the programs that I owned. And there were people that were saying, well, it costs too much money. It was in the order of tens of millions per year. And I said, so we have to change this. Well, I had this very direct conversation with the two-star where I said, let me get this straight. This system does cost a fair amount of money, but with it, you get all the seats that you need. You get all the support for whenever you need it, which will tailor the system to exactly what a commander wants, when they want it, almost instantaneously. And through it, you're able to access, utilize, and put to good effect the other billions of dollars you're spending on everything else in your enterprise are able to be used effectively to successfully fight a global counterinsurgency more complex than anything we've ever seen. And you think this couple tens of, that this is too much money. The most successful thing we've ever had. So in order to do that, then I had to pull out some other numbers and say, we are spending 3 times as much to develop our own internal solution so that we don't have to be offended by paying these people over here who are actually quite competent at what they do. And you looked at the wasted resources and the wasted energy that just came out of trying to fight the system instead of saying, that works, run with it.
So how broken is the system? It's an unfair question, right? And we're talking about just the Department of Defense, let alone the broader intelligence community. It's arguably one of the largest technological enterprises in human history, right? So there can be pockets of extraordinary success and pockets of extraordinary waste. That's inevitable, right? But I think more to your personal experiences, as you look back on those systemic challenges, I think that there's many examples where the folks are demanding something and don't get it, right? And the folks that some new stuff comes in, but it's not working. And so there's this, the story of that Pat I told earlier about that system that was handed to the aircraft carrier 2 days before deployment. He just unplugged it or threw it in the ocean or whatever. But there must have been somebody somewhere demanding something like it to then, we got it to you just in time. There's the counterpoint of that story, I think that you alluded to, where, we're actually trying to make changes and help solve some of these problems. So, but there's it seems like this swirl between what folks are asking for, what gets funded, what's actually useful. They almost seem like different units independently making those decisions. The person buying the food is not making the food and is not eating the food. And then you wonder why people are confused. So if that's the system, broadly speaking, what I'm curious about is to put that question then broadly in context for today's moment, which, at least from the industrial Silicon Valley investor community, is dominated by AI and the next version of large language models, LLMs, and agentic AI, all these new feature sets that in many sectors have already been transformed, whether it be self-driving cars in cities, like Austin and San Francisco, or in just the way legal and accounting services get done. Like the changes happened and just getting started. And so when I talk to service members at a lower, younger age and vintage, they're native to these systems, but when I talk to senior officers, they don't know what the hell I'm talking about. So it just seems like also asking who's the one asking for it, who's the one necessarily using it. Oh, sorry, but I was going to ask a question, but you guys were laughing at me. So please, what did I say? What happened?
What I was going to say is use an example where I was doing some talks and some coursework on F-35 Charlie, the carrier version of F-35s. And they were doing a debrief for a lot of senior naval aviators. And then I happened to be in the room too, because I was with the Wing G2. So they had the glass up at the front of the room where they showed the screens and what was the air combat like and what was the scenario. And they showed 4 pilots that had been on this mission, all in F-35s, and what did they do? And of course, there were different ages, and 3 of them had transitioned from F-18s to F-35s, and they were older. And then there was this young lieutenant, 03, who had only ever flown the F-35. And the 3 older pilots are describing the mission. And of course, there's watches and there's banking, and they're talking with their hands and talking about the complexity. And the lieutenant looked absolutely bored out of his mind. And when he started debriefing, it was like nothing. He had grown up with systems that interfaced with him the way this aircraft does. And so all the different ancillary things that are going on in the cockpit that are happening, it was like a big video game to him. And so he got done with his brief, and the others all started talking about, he was flying circles around us. He was able to do this. He was able to do that. The flight school was shorter. And it was just because the aircraft wasn't designed for people like us. It was designed for the kids that grew up with these digital environments and can harness these sensors and interface with them better than we can. And so
I think I just got promoted to being a graybeard. Did you hear that, Pat? I think Sully just elevated me, or I'm really tired and he's seeing more gray hairs on me that I have not yet earned. I think he said we, Pat. Did you hear that right? We have another. We're recording this session. I don't know if Sully knows this, but this is being recorded.
Yeah, look, I know you're a young dude, but I'm pretty sure you've broken 45.
No comment. No comment on that.
Right.
And for those that can't see, I'm literally the only human being on this line not with the actual gray beard, goatee. I don't know what the right technical term is here. But the point is taken, Sully, but I interrupted Pat out here. What were you going to say there, sir?
So, back to the system, you'd ask originally if it's broken. I would say it's not broken. It's working as designed. It's a 1970 Nova.
That's working.
It's slow, and we're asking it to race in an F1 race at this point. And so the system itself, I mean, you and I think chatted about this before. The acquisition system with all of its checks and balances and stakeholders, and that's its own problem. Everybody that's a stakeholder is not actually a decision maker. That creates its own time delays, risk aversion, et cetera. Is designed by McNamara in the 60s, specifically to delay us from over surprising the Soviets into starting a war, because he knew that U.S. industry could out innovate the adversary at the time. Well, we haven't really changed it that much. We've grown it quite a bit, but it's still a 1970 Nova. So what do we need to do? Like, I'm excited about these things. I mean, a little bit long time in coming, but like software acquisition pathways, those kind of things, still gravely underutilized. But it's also the mindset, like the Sullys, we're designing systems to work with people that grew up with iPads. That is awesome. They know what a user experience feel like. They know what a human machine interface feels like in the right way. But the system and the culture takes a generation to change. I don't think we have a generation to waste on doing that. So, anything we can do from industry to accelerate that, absolutely. But it's going to take a little bit. It's going to be some hard fights. Back to the stakeholders. I've been a buyer, I've been an executive sponsor, I've been all kind of, champion, a user, and I just got exhausted even wearing a uniform with the number of people who thought they were stakeholders in a capability that I needed, and they really weren't. So,
is that the magic wand disruption that you wish could happen now? It sounds like it's not necessarily a technological change. It sounds like it's an operational, cultural, organizational change.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, what I would say to that is, I had a lot of joint time in my career. And after the last big bulk of it, which is when I, unfortunately ran across Pat, I had SOCOM and then went off to do CJTF OIR. So I came back from that back to the Marine Corps. And something that I started to say a lot when I was at Third MAW and then at the depot was, Marines are allowed to have nice things. Okay. Throughout our careers and our history, we've been cultured and accustomed to having crap. Okay. Stuff that doesn't work. We get the Army's hand downs. We get the last thing, all this other kind of stuff. So Marines they get a new piece of gear and they think, well, this sucks. It doesn't work. And they set it off to the side and they find another way to get it done. And there's a mindset of saying you have to, as commanders, as NCOs, agitate until you get the system that works, because people think it's working. They think they've given you good equipment and they think they've solved the problem, but they don't realize. I mean, I ran into a situation where a major system was just sitting in the corner and Marines were not able to use it at all. And when I asked, they said, well, it's not allowed to go on the MXN S, on the Garrison SIPRNet. You can't put it on the network. Network protocols don't allow you to. So this can't be true. This has got to be just something on the base. I call around to other friends in other units. They were all doing the same thing. Oh yeah, it doesn't work, so we just don't use it. And it's like, well, we just accepted that that's just the way it is. We won't use it unless we're in the field. You'd never issue an infantry marine a rifle and then tell him he only gets to touch it when he goes to combat. That just wouldn't happen.
I gotta say, I gotta love that story, and I'm just like so angry as I'm listening to it. I'm just like boiling on the inside because I saw it myself less than you did, but I completely agree. In the Navy, I was a Navy nuke. In the Navy nuclear community, we had these 7 principles of leadership. The number 7 was questioning attitude. You had to question The very low. In an environment, by the way, was rigorously focused on procedural compliance. So there seemed to be a bit of a contradiction there, by the way, in hindsight. But I think that was the intent. It was like, wait, are you sure you're not allowed to use this? Probably the best advice that I got on this topic as a colleague to you gentlemen came from Honorable Sue Gordon, a leader in the intelligence community. Her advice to me when we first started our company together was, Ian, great widget. Here's your problem. All I hear coming out of your mouth is risk, risk, risk. But whatever the current system is, you should assume everyone assumes that is the current system is the lowest risk. So any new thing brought in, and your separate access store is a great example. It's just perceived as higher risk than whatever we have right now. And therefore it's dangerous. New is dangerous by design, by culture. And broadly in national security architecture. The irony of that, of course, is what we're doing in the function of security and warfare is intrinsically high risk, very dangerous, but we don't want that. We want to minimize it wherever we can. And so there's this like weird contradiction between being innovative, which is intrinsically changing things, disrupting things, but at the same point, but we can't actually accept that. And so I think that is the theme of what this podcast is trying to explore is what I see as this beautiful contradiction, that there is the actions versus words, the reality from an ultimately, I'll confess, it's not a question. This is just my soapbox moment. I can't resist it, is that I don't know the answer to how to reconcile that. And I am obsessed with trying to understand more about where can we learn from these past experiences to find those beneficial disruptions that ultimately help those that served as you did and those that continue to serve. So any reflections or advice for me on that one as we're on this quest together?
Ian, I would ask as you sort of decomp your nuclear line diagram, as I've seen you do.
Thank you for that. That was a very specific reference, though. That was the Everywhere Navy nuke. I appreciate that. Yeah. Knowing your audience, that was one of your strength points, as you said, in the intel world, is knowing who's receiving the information.
I do pay attention on occasion. Is the system that you're questioning one that is process oriented or is it outcomes oriented? And what is the right answer? What I see, I'd love to hear your thoughts, but I see rigorous adherence to process. I had junior officers show up in the Pentagon to run programs, getting told your only job, don't do anything new. Your only job is to prevent your program from getting killed. To me, that is even worse than just being process oriented. That's like a negative outcome. Never questioning it. They'd only have 6 rules of leadership because they wouldn't have a questioning attitude. So I just get curious on your thoughts in terms of outcomes versus process, because what I see is a ton of process.
I would agree totally. I actually, every once in a while he says something that is like really good, and I try to store it away because it doesn't happen a lot. But when he does, it comes out and
he being Pat-eyed. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
The outcomes in the process is exactly right. It comes down again to the attitudes of the people. The users have to want a better answer, know that a better answer is out there, and not just accept crap. Don't say, well, the process says I have to wait all this time in order to get this thing. No, agitate. In that case that I mentioned, we agitated until the system changed. Because nobody in the acquisition process, ultimately, when it gets back to the senior military staffs, nobody wants to put a bad product out there. Nobody wants to fail their soldiers, sailors, Marines, all that. They just don't know. And they think what they're putting out there is the right solution. And so if you just stick to the process, bad things happen. You've got to be able to say at the end of the day, is this a useful thing? Does this make the soldier's life better? Does a Marine want to use this? And so that's gotta work. The stuff that we saw in the early 90s or the late 80s gear that we trained with when we first came in, that was some clunky stuff. That was not real efficient the way most of it was laid out. Well, we've agitated, we've gotten some better gear. We got to keep it going. So I think it's getting people to understand there's a process, but it has to lead to a useful outcome. You can't just pick a side and stick with one or the other.
Let's close off here with a look to the future. So on those outcomes, again, with no specific endorsement or slamgram against any individual people or companies or innovations or capabilities, I think that anything what we're watching this week is the Congress are trying to sort that out. And may or may not be having an easy job of that at the levels of actual investments in our nation's national security future. But just you as individuals, what are some of the things that you're excited about? What are some of those outcomes and changes and disruptions that you expect to see or want to see in the next couple of years? Pat or Sully, why don't you go first?
I'm legitimately excited by the stuff that we're doing. That may sound like a Pat thing or what Turbine One is doing, but I tell you, it's the ability for a intel officer, for a regular grunt to say, this is what I want to find, create a model for it and put it out there. That to me is amazing. That's not some pre-selected library of things. And that is, if you want to talk about something revolutionary, that is pretty incredible. And I'm excited to see where it goes, because had I had something like that in Fallujah and Ramadi and throughout Al-Anbar, where you're telling me I could have my own mini aircraft at the battalion or company or lower level, and it could just look around the corner and find these things I'm trying to find. I mean, that no soldier has ever had that. And I think that's pretty damn amazing, because you can do things to affect things for a staff or a national level command that makes their decision making easier. But when you're creating things that use the technology at the lowest level to save lives and to allow those soldiers and Marines and sailors to fight more effectively, that's cool, because that's out of a laboratory, that's out of some big ops center, and it's out in the dirt where it matters.
I agree with Sully there. I'm excited about that too. Pushing trust and capability to much lower levels is going to be game changing in a lot of ways. It may be another, revolution in military affairs. I think they used to call it at the War College when Sully didn't study. The bigger picture, though, what I'm excited about is, as a fan of deterrence and a fan of not fighting wars we don't need to, is going to be in and around us as a nation mustering manufacturing capacity, Silicon Valley technology, and other pockets of technology out there. It's certainly not just Silicon Valley, to create advantage that actually creates deterrence. Last thing we want to do is fight a major theater war, too costly, for a number of reasons. Enemy gets a vote, and if they decide to get in a bar fight with us, having tools like the ones we're working on and many others are as well, gives us a fighting chance. So I'm excited about that. And then, acquisition reform and other things will take a little bit of time, but I'm confident our sailors and Marines and other service members are going to get better tools going forward. It's our job, right?
Well, for me personally, it's an honor to be working with you both. So Ed and Ed, Navy and Marine Corps veterans, thank you so much for joining me on our second ever episode of this podcast. I appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thanks, Ian.